A few weeks ago, Amnesty International put out a 269-page report detailing the atrocities committed against the Palestinian people in Gaza. The report is very dense and well-researched, and Amnesty International uses it to argue that Israel is committing a genocide in Gaza. I understand that not everyone has the time to go through a 296-page report, so I thought I would do it for you and share what I consider to be the most damning evidence and arguments levied against Israel. I still recommend you read it for yourself if you have time. It's very heavy and hard to stomach, but this is the first time a major human rights organization has accused Israel of the crime of crimes. But if you can't, I'll do my best to fill you in. This video will not be monetized, partly because I don't want an ad to interrupt these serious topics, and partly because it will be highly derivative of the Amnesty International report with many references and direct quotes. I'll just be relaying the information to you and sprinkling in my opinions where appropriate. So let's do that. We're going to start by looking over Israel's obligations under international law, then move on to defining genocide, and finally, we will take a look at the Israeli authorities' actions, lack of actions, and dehumanizing genocidal statements against Palestinian people. Although it may not seem like it, Israel does have obligations under international humanitarian law, including the law of occupation as the occupying power in both the West Bank and Gaza. International humanitarian law, or the law of war, binds all parties to an armed conflict with the goal to limit human suffering by balancing military necessity with human well-being. It aims to protect sick and injured civilians, captured combatants, and so forth. In addition to looking out for civilians, these laws regulate the means and methods of warfare and impose obligations on military occupiers. The principal instruments of international humanitarian law are the 4 Geneva Conventions of 1949 and their 2 additional protocols of 1977. Israel is a party to the Geneva Conventions, but it hasn't ratified the protocols. Nonetheless, it remains bound by the rules that form part of international customary humanitarian law. In Gaza, Israel is considered the occupying power under international law due to its significant control over Gaza's borders, airspace, and access to resources. It's true that Israel pulled its presence out of Gaza in 2005, but instead of allowing for meaningful autonomy for the people of Gaza, Israel's presence moved just outside the perimeter and continued tight control. Israel still remained as the occupying authority. Under the laws of war, Israel's obligations are as follows. They must distinguish between civilians and combatants and only target legitimate military objectives. They must prioritize proportionality, meaning avoiding attacks where civilian strife would be excessive relative to the anticipated military advantage. And they must take the necessary steps to minimize harm to civilians and civilian objects. International human rights law remains applicable even during armed conflict to ensure the protection of civilians' rights. The 4th Geneva Convention imposes specific obligations on an occupying power, requiring it to provide special protection and humane treatment to the inhabitants of the occupied territory, who are considered protected persons. These individuals are protected against all acts of violence, threats, torture, and other ill treatment, and they must be treated humanely at all times. As the occupying power, Israel bears responsibility for the welfare of the population under its control, including maintaining law and order and ensuring the provision of basic necessities. The Hague Regulations, which Israel has not ratified, but nonetheless the Israeli High Court has found to be part of customary international law and binding on all states, including the ones who never ratified, states the following. Article 43 says that the occupying power shall take all the measures in his power to restore and ensure, as far as possible, public order and safety while respecting, unless absolutely prevented, the laws in force in the country. Article 56 of the Hague Regulations prohibits seizure, deliberate destruction, or intentional damage done to institutions dedicated to culture, religion, education, charity, history, and so forth. Keep this in mind because, as we will see, Israel not only brazenly disobeys these rules that its own high court considers to be binding, but IDF soldiers document themselves doing so while laughing at and mocking the destruction. This sentiment is also present in Article 53 of the 4th Geneva Convention, which states that Israel, as the occupying power, cannot destroy Palestinian homes or properties unless it is militarily necessary to do so. As this video progresses, we will see a good many instances where military necessity was lacking, yet destruction took place regardless. I know this part of the video is tedious and could possibly bore some people, so I'm going to wrap it up quickly by listing off a few more of Israel's obligations and acts to avoid under international law. Unlawful, wanton destruction of Palestinian properties not justified by military necessity constitutes a war crime and violates the Geneva Conventions. Deportation or forced transfer of populations is prohibited unless absolutely necessary for civilian safety or military operations, and even then, the occupying power must ensure adequate living conditions for the displaced and ensure they return safely to their homes once hostilities cease. Israel must provide food and medical supplies to Gaza and facilitate humanitarian aid under Articles 55, 56, and 59 of the Fourth Geneva Convention. Collective punishment is explicitly prohibited by Article 33 of the Fourth Geneva Convention. Palestinians are protected persons under international law. The ICJ has also made a preliminary finding that Palestinians, quote, constitute a distinct national, ethnical, racial, or religious group, and hence a protected group within the meaning of the Genocide Convention. Armed conflict rules require distinguishing between civilians and combatants, with civilian objects presumed non-military unless proven otherwise. Indiscriminate attacks, such as the use of disproportionate weapons in populated areas, are prohibited. Israel uses 2,000-pound bombs in densely populated areas, by the way, but we'll get to that in a bit. Medical personnel, hospitals, and those transporting supplies must be respected and protected, with warnings required before attacking medical facilities. Intentional destruction of cultural, religious, educational, or historical buildings constitutes a war crime. Israel must not deprive civilians of survival essentials, destroy objects indispensable to civilian life, or impede humanitarian aid per customary international law and the law of belligerent occupation. If Israel cannot provide basic necessities, it must allow impartial humanitarian organizations to deliver relief rapidly and without obstruction. Under international humanitarian law, states must investigate and prosecute war crimes committed by their forces or on their territory. Israel must respect the right to life and ensure accountability for arbitrary killings by its agents. Now that we know some of the many obligations of the Israeli state and any other state that finds itself in a similar situation, we need to cover what exactly genocide is under international law. Article 2 of the Genocide Convention defines genocide as specific acts committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. These acts include killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm, deliberately creating conditions calculated to destroy the group, preventing births, and forcibly transferring children. So if one or more of these prohibited acts takes place and is committed with the intent to destroy the protected group, in whole or in part, then that fits the definition of genocide. What distinguishes genocide from other crimes is the requirement of a specific intent known as dolo specialis. It's important to note that total annihilation is not a requirement. The intent to destroy even a substantial part of the group, which is not measured by any sort of numeric threshold, will do. As the ICJ puts it, the part targeted must be significant enough to have an impact on the group as a whole. Palestinians in Gaza are part of a protected group and serve as a substantial portion of Palestinians. This intent component makes genocide uniquely difficult to prove and creates a hierarchy of crimes where genocide carries greater societal weight despite crimes like extermination often being equally severe in practice and being punishable by similar sentencing. This emphasis on genocide, in my opinion, is well-intentioned, but historically it has led to inconsistent applications as seen in Yugoslavia. For example, the Srebrenica massacre is rightly considered as a genocide, but similar massacres in other enclaves and parts of Bosnia are not. This inconsistency allows states like Israel to evade accountability for actions prohibited by the Genocide Convention, but are difficult to prove as genocide under the strict intent requirement. As a result, Israel, or any other analogous state, can then distance itself from the moral culpability it deserves and leverage the lack of genocide charges to deflect from its clear human rights abuses and war crimes. This imbalance suggests to me that the heightened focus on genocide as the crime of crimes, combined with its notoriously inconsistent legal application, might actually hinder the pursuit of justice in cases where intent is hard to prove, leading to states pointing at the lack of genocide charges and deflecting a degree of accountability due to this hierarchy of crimes. Nonetheless, Amnesty International, a massive human rights organization, has not only accused Israel of genocide, but laid out a concise, well-written, and thoroughly researched case as to why they did so, and I agree with them. Let's take a look at that definition again. The third prohibited act, the one about deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, has had some light shined on it by international jurisprudence, which provides these examples to highlight what can be considered a breach of this rule. Subjecting the group to a sustenance diet, reducing essential medical services below a minimum requirement, systematically expelling members of the group from their homes, generally creating circumstances that would lead to a slow death, such as lack of proper food, water, shelter, clothing, or sanitation, and subjecting members of the group to excessive work or physical exertion. Again, since intent is hard to prove, The International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia has ruled that the objective probability of these conditions leading to the physical destruction of the group should be taken into consideration. The factors to be considered according to the ICTY are the actual nature of the conditions of life, the length of time that members of the group were subjected to them, and the characteristics of the group, such as its vulnerability. So children, sick people, and so forth. So even if you can't prove intent to destroy a group by bringing about these conditions, if the conditions imposed show an objective probability of leading to the physical destruction of the group, that will do. Furthermore, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda and the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia have established that specific intent, dolo specialis, for genocide can be inferred from circumstantial evidence instead of requiring explicit proof. The following factors can be used to infer intent: the broader context of the acts, systematic targeting of the same group, scale and repetition of atrocities, the number of and indiscriminate targeting of victims, attempts to conceal crimes, use of derogatory and dehumanizing language, and political doctrines underlying the acts. Again, I'm sorry if this is boring you, but I promise it's really important and we will get to the meat of this report soon. Deliberate destruction of cultural or religious property in the absence of a legitimate military objective can also serve as evidence of intent to destroy a group, notably when combined with physical or biological destruction. The ICTY has emphasized looking at evidence holistically, so in the context of the broader conflict, rather than isolating individual acts. The context and history of the Palestinian plight, specifically the plight of Palestinians in Gaza, is imperative to keep in mind when inferring intent. Genocidal intent can still coexist with military aims. The fact that a military conflict or a war is taking place in a region does not preclude actors from holding multiple intentions. The ICJ concluded that for specific intent to be inferred, the intent to destroy a group in whole or in part must be the only reasonable conclusion drawn from the evidence. With all of that said, let's finally get into Israel's actions, in some cases lack thereof, and dehumanizing language used against Palestinians. In this report, Amnesty International focused on 15 of the many Israeli airstrikes in Gaza and investigated them thoroughly. The findings are horrific. In total, there were 334 killed, including 141 children, and no evidence of military objectives in any of these attacks. According to Amnesty, the Israeli military's responses regarding the attacks on the St. Porphyrius Church compound and the street market in Al-Maghazi were vague, with no substantiated claims of legitimate military targets or fighters in the vicinity. Amnesty reports that as of September 30th, 2024, no criminal investigation has been initiated by the Office of the Military Advocate General into these cases. All 15 of these airstrikes were attacks on civilian objects. In 14 of these attacks, the people in the locations hit received no prior warning. In the other instance, the attack on the Al-Nakla family home in Nusayrat refugee camp on October 8, 2023, the people did receive a warning, but it was not an effective one. In that case, the family fled their home after their neighbor received a warning that his home would be bombed. Since 5 hours passed and no bombing took place, the family thought it was a misunderstanding and believed it would be safe to return to collect some of their necessities. Once they returned to collect their belongings, Israeli forces bombed their home, killing 4 people and injuring 20 others. Again, Amnesty International found no evidence in any of these cases that there was any legitimate military objectives in or near the locations bombed. Keep in mind, Israel is obligated to do whatever it can to minimize the loss of innocent civilian life. You tell me if what I'm about to tell you sounds like the actions of a deeply concerned and benevolent Israeli military. Not only did they strike these 15 locations with no effective warnings, they used wide-range explosives in densely populated civilian areas. In some cases, large US-manufactured JDAM explosives were used. And in some instances, Israeli forces would conduct these airstrikes in the middle of the night while people were sleeping. Amnesty International found that 12 of the 15 attacks it investigated were strikes on homes and residential buildings, 5 of which were bombed between 11 p.m. and 4 a.m. One example was that of the Harb family, whose home was hit just before dawn on December 12, 2023, while they were all sleeping. 25 members of the family, all civilians, were killed. Israel carried out these attacks, all lacking any legitimate military objective, and a good amount of them while people were asleep. This does not indicate that Israeli forces are all too concerned with mitigating the loss of innocent life, nor are they concerned with bringing those responsible for these killings to justice, even though they are obligated to do so under international humanitarian law. You should see my notes as I was going through this PDF. I guess I shouldn't have been surprised, but I was. Amnesty International reached out to the Israeli Ministry of Defense for an explanation, but it didn't receive a response. I don't want to share all the details about all the civilians killed because it's gruesome and horrible and something I recommend you read for yourself. However, I will share one of the stories from this report. At about 11:20 p.m. on April 20th, 2024, the Abdalal family house in Rafah, the area in which Gazans were told would be a safe space to seek refuge, was struck by Israeli forces, killing 16 children and 4 women, all members of the same family. Rafah was Gaza's most densely populated governorate by far, and it wasn't uncommon for buildings in the area to be packed with dozens of people. The victims in this specific attack were asleep when the house was hit. 3 generations of Palestinians were killed in that strike. Hussein Abdalal, who lost his mother, wives, and children in that attack, told Amnesty International that all he had left of them were shreds and pieces of clothing, and he would find them without heads. In a just world, this story would spark all the outrage that the fake beheaded baby story did, but it's happening to Palestinians, so the mainstream media doesn't seem all too eager to report on it. Between October 7th of 2023 and October 7th of 2024, the Gaza-based Ministry of Health recorded 42,000 Palestinian fatalities in Gaza. This does not include those still buried beneath the rubble or those missing. Just under 60% of these confirmed fatalities were children, women, and the elderly. The remaining 40% were men under 60 with no independent organizations able to establish how many were combatants and how many were civilians. By October 7th, 2024, 97,500 Gazans had been injured, and by July 2024, at least 22,500 Gazans had been left with life-changing injuries. To read directly from the Amnesty report, while these 15 cases represent only a small fraction of the total number of aerial attacks on Gaza by Israel following October 7th, 2023, other human rights organizations have concluded, as regards other airstrikes, that Israel carried out direct attacks on civilians and civilian objects or indiscriminate attacks that resulted in the death of civilians. The cases documented by Amnesty International and other organizations demonstrate a pattern of repeated direct and indiscriminate attacks by the Israeli military in Gaza over the 9-month period under review. Such attacks were conducted in ways that were designed to cause a very high number of fatalities among the civilian population, as evidenced through Israel's use of explosive weapons with wide area effects, the timing and location of attacks, and the absence of effective warnings in some cases, or of any warnings at all in others. Viewed in isolation, some of the attacks analyzed and the resultant high civilian death toll may be attributed to recklessness or negligence on the part of the Israeli military. However, viewed together and cumulatively, over the course of 9 months, when committed by one of the most technologically advanced militaries in the world, Israel's repetition of such deadly attacks, many on homes and other buildings in densely populated civilian neighborhoods, indicates intentional and deliberate direct attacks on civilians, or equally intentional and deliberately indiscriminate attacks. These acts were specifically committed against Palestinians in Gaza, who are a substantial part of a protected group under the Genocide Convention. Crucial to inferring intent, we need to look at Israel's actions when it comes to inflicting conditions intended to bring about the destruction of Palestinians in Gaza. Critical and life-sustaining infrastructure and other objects indispensable to the survival of the Palestinian population in Gaza were destroyed by Israel during the 9-month period reviewed by Amnesty International. This included essential parts of the food production system. Huge tracts of land dedicated to cultivating potatoes, wheat, and strawberries were destroyed. The Food and Agriculture Organization, or FAO, reported that more than a quarter of the greenhouses in Gaza and hundreds of agricultural sites had been damaged. UNICEF found that about 63% of the permanent crop fields in Gaza showed a decline in health and density, which was attributed to bombing and shelling by the FAO. Newly cleared land along Gaza's eastern border, which happened to be where Gaza's most fertile land was located, was destroyed by the Israeli military, who used bulldozers and manually placed landmines in the attempt to expand a buffer zone. Human Rights Watch reported on Israeli forces razing agricultural land while simultaneously deliberately blocking the delivery of food, water, and fuel to the people in Gaza and impeding humanitarian assistance. They argue that by depriving the population of Gaza of objects indispensable to their survival, agricultural capabilities, and pairing that with the obstruction of food, water, and aid, Israel was using starvation of civilians as a method of warfare. Aside from this, Gaza's ability to produce food once hostilities cease has been significantly damaged. A staff member of the Union of Agricultural Work Committees said that Israel stole the ability to produce food from Gaza. Hundreds of thousands of residential buildings were destroyed as well in the process of decimating critical infrastructure. About 62% of homes in Gaza were damaged or destroyed by January 2024. The damage and destruction is estimated to have affected over 1 million people. Thousands of homes and structures were damaged or destroyed during Israel's attempt to expand the buffer zone on Gaza's eastern perimeter. As of May 2024, more than 90% of the buildings within this area, including schools, homes, and places of worship, were destroyed or damaged. After further investigation into the decimation in areas within this buffer zone, it was found that extensive damage and destruction of property and agricultural land was carried out after Israeli forces had acquired operational control of these areas, meaning the decimation was not a result of hostilities between Israeli forces and Hamas. This was a deliberate attempt to destroy critical infrastructure without legitimate military necessity. Let's move on to water, sanitation, and energy infrastructure. Around 84% of health facility buildings and 57% of water infrastructure in Gaza were either destroyed or damaged. Multiple images uploaded by the Gaza City municipality revealed severe damage to water carriers, generators, pumps, drainage, and sewage lines. This, paired with the destruction of all the heavy machinery at the Al-Fukari landfill, the final disposal site for solid waste from the governorate south of Wadi Gaza, led to a severe waste management crisis. With sewage and wastewater systems inoperable, raw sewage frequently flooded Gaza's streets, contributing to the spread of illness and disease. Over 60% of the electricity distribution network was also targeted. Reputable organizations investigating the damage to Gaza's critical infrastructure concluded that much of it was caused by the Israeli military, which was fully aware of the destruction to vital resources necessary for the survival of Gaza's civilian population. Under international humanitarian law, Israel is required to facilitate rapid aid to mitigate this damage and ensure the population's quality of life meets specific standards. Instead, Israel obstructed and delayed the delivery of humanitarian aid and essential supplies into Gaza. Israel justified its fuel restrictions on safety grounds, but failed to explain why other energy sources, such as electricity, couldn't be supplied. While Israel claimed that 9 out of 10 electricity lines into Gaza had been damaged, they never clarified why those lines weren't repaired. In July 2024, under immense international pressure, Israel agreed to allow the direct supply of electricity to a UN-managed water desalination plant, but by September 30th, 2024, this step had not been taken, even after the feeder lines were repaired. This shows that Israel was in fact capable of agreeing to actions intended to mitigate harm to civilians, but just chose not to for months. In addition to everything I've already mentioned, Israel obstructed the import of alternative energy sources like solar panels into Gaza. Now let's look at hospitals. Doctors in the region reported that hospitals' abilities to perform their duties was severely obstructed due to a lack of supplies, constant evacuation orders that forced closures, and the abandonment of what little resources they had, the killings and disappearances of medical staff, and raids or attacks that caused significant damage to facilities. Some hospitals, such as Al-Shifa Hospital in Gaza City, were raided by Israeli forces at least twice. Human Rights Watch documented multiple Israeli attacks that caused extensive damage to hospitals. CNN reported that by December 2023, 20 out of 22 hospitals in northern Gaza had been destroyed or damaged, with craters near 11 of these hospitals indicating the use of 2,000-pound bombs. Why use 2,000-pound bombs near hospitals filled with civilians? I don't know. Repeated and unorganized displacements were also used by Israeli authorities in a way that suggests they were attempting to bring about conditions intended to destroy Palestinians in Gaza. About 90% of Gaza's population was displaced internally, with many people forced to move more than once, some up to 10 times. Israeli authorities claimed these evacuation orders were meant to protect civilians from military activity, saying more evacuations were necessary because Hamas and other groups had moved with the civilian population. But if these orders were actually about protecting Palestinians, shoving them into overcrowded, unsanitary campsites, blocking humanitarian aid, and then forcing them to move again isn't very protective. Some people were even stuck sleeping next to solid waste dumps or sewage pipelines. Under international law, Israel, as the occupying power, is supposed to make sure people have proper accommodations, clean water, decent food, and basic health and sanitation. They're also supposed to make sure civilians can safely return to their homes once the fighting ends, as per Article 49 of the 4th Geneva Convention. On top of that, international human rights law says they need to provide food, medicine, and housing, or if they can't for some reason, they must allow for humanitarian organizations to administer that aid in a rapid and unimpeded fashion, meaning no arbitrary stops or lengthy bureaucratic processes that slow down the distribution of aid. Israel did not abide by this, but we'll get into the specifics in a bit. Israel could have done literally anything to protect civilians, let them go back to their homes in northern Gaza, let them temporarily relocate to the West Bank, or even let them into Israel. About 70% of Gaza's population are refugees or descendants of refugees who were kicked out during the Nakba, and international law says they have the right to return to those lands. Any of these options would have been better than trapping people in overcrowded, unhygienic camps and subjecting them to illness and disease. To make things worse, the Israeli military didn't publish an official list of the evacuation orders. Instead, these orders were delivered in confusing, contradictory, and inefficient ways that led to Palestinians being unable to rely on just one source. The means of delivery included social media posts by Kogat, a unit in the Israeli Ministry of Defense, airdropped leaflets, and a digital map that could be accessed by scanning a QR code. Seems like a bad way to deliver life-preserving orders given the lack of access to electricity. Sometimes, Kogat failed to post evacuation orders on its Facebook page, even though the Israeli military's Arabic media spokesperson had issued them, leaving portions of Gaza's population unaware of the orders. Kogat also issued evacuations through mocking imagery and messages. One post shows a fake weather report warning Palestinians that the weather in their region would be, quote, heavy rains of missiles and shells, while contrasting other parts of Gaza, the parts where people were ordered to flee to, as being clear, comfortable, and sunny. Take note at these laughing reactions on Facebook, contrasted with the desperate pleas in the comments. Israel dropped leaflets saying anyone who stays in North Gaza would be considered an accomplice to terrorism and lose their protected status, even though there is no basis for a threat of that kind under international law. Yet, on social media, after public outcry, the official Israeli X account claimed it had no intention of considering those who have yet to evacuate as members of a terrorist group. This is an important point because, as we will see later, the conflation of terrorists and Gazan civilians is constantly made by Israeli authorities, forces, and settlers. This is absolutely unacceptable and illegal. Israeli forces made innocent Palestinians leave their homes through Israeli-designated humanitarian corridors and walk for kilometers waving white flags without basic necessities. One 30-year-old woman reported that, on her third displacement, she was forced to flee from Gaza City to Khan Yunis in a wheelchair pushed by her husband. Her earlier displacement took place after Israeli forces bombed her house, killing 5 members of her family, which led her to seek refuge at a school in a refugee camp. That camp was also bombed by Israeli forces, resulting in the amputation of her right leg and putting her in that wheelchair. The severity and pace at which this damage occurred has not been seen in any other conflict in the 21st century. According to a joint interim report by the World Bank, UN, and EU, the levels of destruction in Gaza are unprecedented. I'm going to repeat myself here because this is crucial to understand. As the occupying power, Israel is obligated not only to ensure that the population of Gaza has adequate access to essential supplies like food, shelter, medicine, and sanitary environments, but it is also obligated to facilitate rapid and unimpeded passage of impartial humanitarian relief for civilians in need, as is stated under customary international humanitarian law. Now let's see if Israel did its part to comply. Between October 2023 and July 2024, Israeli authorities adopted policies and actions that resulted in the obstruction and denial of essential services and supplies to Gazan Palestinians. Israel implemented a total siege policy, maintained an unlawful blockade, refused to open access points to Gaza for sufficient aid to enter and be distributed, cut off access to electricity and fuel, and failed to facilitate adequate access for humanitarian organizations to distribute life-saving aid, food, water, and medicine within Gaza. The impact of Israel's conduct was made clear to Israeli authorities by humanitarian officials who warned them about the destruction their actions caused and exacerbated. According to Amnesty International, at no point between October 2023 and July 2024 did Israeli authorities ease restrictions to adequately allow humanitarian organizations to provide Palestinians in Gaza with the appropriate volume and array of aid and life-saving supplies. In fact, Israeli officials actively impeded humanitarian organizations' ability to do their job by implementing arbitrary and bureaucratic barriers, including failing to open access points to Gaza and imposing lengthy, arbitrary, and unprecedented processes for organizations to import goods. By cutting off electricity and tightly controlling access to fuel, they further hindered humanitarian efforts. This conduct blatantly disregards their obligations under international law to facilitate rapid aid and instead aligns with Israeli officials' promises to create, quote, hell for those in Gaza. The UN humanitarian coordinator for the OPT, Lynn Hastings, told UN News on October 15, 2023, that humanitarian organizations were ready and willing to bring aid for Palestinians in Gaza, but they were still waiting for Israeli approval. Hastings stated that Israel was connecting humanitarian assistance into Gaza with the release of hostages, which, if true, sounds a lot like collective punishment and is illegal. Israeli officials were fully aware of the humanitarian crisis and only opened 2 crossing points in southern Gaza, the Rafah crossing and, after immense international pressure, the Kerem Shalom crossing into Israel. Even after opening the Kerem Shalom crossing, Israel continued to impede access into Gaza via both this and the Rafah crossing. In January 2024, the ICJ ordered Israel to take effective measures to facilitate and enable humanitarian aid into Gaza immediately. Israel ignored this order. Amnesty International found that as late as a month after the ICJ order, Israel still disobeyed and failed to take even the bare minimum steps to comply. Within 3 weeks of the ICJ order, the number of trucks entering Gaza actually decreased by about a third. In April 2024, following mounting international pressure due to the killing of innocent humanitarians working for World Central Kitchen on April 1st, Israel made commitments to better facilitate aid, improve coordination between the IDF and humanitarians, and temporarily open the Erez crossing in northern Gaza. This proves Israel could have taken these actions all along but chose not to, resulting in unnecessary suffering and death. Aid groups had been pleading for these measures for months. Only after the killing of World Central Kitchen workers did then Minister of Defense Yoav Gallant tell journalists that Israel would, quote, flood Gaza with aid. Gisha, an Israeli nonprofit concerned with protecting the freedom and movement of Palestinians, pointed out, the fact that these measures were not implemented months ago is inexplicable and inexcusable. Every day that passes while plans are touted but not put into practice leads to more unnecessary death and indescribable suffering for Palestinians in Gaza. Without a full, long-lasting ceasefire, and lacking effective coordination with aid agencies on the ground, these steps, inasmuch as they are implemented, will remain insufficient. Despite Gallant's promises, humanitarian organizations reported that the anticipated flood of aid never materialized. They observed no significant improvement from Israeli authorities in addressing the dire challenges of providing life-saving aid. The situation worsened when Israel began its ground invasion into Rafah, the southern Gaza governorate where Palestinians had been told to flee to. Rafah, a crucial crossing point for aid, was taken over by Israeli forces, who destroyed parts of it, further exacerbating the crisis. On May 24, 2024, the ICJ stepped in with a third order, demanding that Israel immediately stop its military offensive in Rafah and avoid any actions that could lead to the physical destruction of Palestinians in Gaza. They also insisted that Israel keep the Rafah crossing open for essential aid and services. Just 4 days later, 20 aid organizations confirmed that the crossings were still, quote, effectively shut to meaningful humanitarian assistance, and that the attacks on Rafah were actually increasing. To quote directly from the Amnesty International report, the scale of the attacks, the number of civilian victims spread across ages and genders and within multi-generational families, the repetition of destructive acts, and the perpetration of other culpable acts systemically targeted at the same group are all factors that indicate genocidal intent when considered holistically with others. Such conditions of life were the combined results of a number of deliberate policies, actions, and omissions by Israel. These included Israel's role in and knowledge of the large-scale damage to and destruction of critical infrastructure and other objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population following 7 October 2023, combined with Israel's mass and repeated forced displacement of the vast majority of Gaza's population under unsafe and unsanitary conditions, and Israel's denial and obstruction of the delivery of essential services and life-saving supplies into and within Gaza. The combination of these deliberate policies, actions, and omissions by Israel led to entirely foreseeable consequences, including widespread and severe hunger, disease, and death. The 17-year-old unlawful blockade of Gaza has laid the groundwork for Israel to rapidly create these conditions. It is significant that Israel maintained its approach despite mounting evidence of its impact, warnings and calls by international bodies, and numerous legally binding orders by the ICJ. To further illustrate not only intent but also the brazen disrespect and desire to destroy Palestinian infrastructure in history, videos have been collected showing Israeli soldiers celebrating or mocking the destruction or burning religious texts inside damaged mosques. Universities, mosques, and other culturally significant buildings have been decimated by Israeli forces. The ICJ has established that when these acts are carried out deliberately, they can be considered evidence of intent to destroy a group. The Amnesty report documents cases of destroyed cultural and religious sites, and in many instances, Israeli forces were in control of them at the time of destruction, suggesting that there was no military imperative and that the destruction was carried out deliberately and without justification. Images of Israeli soldiers mocking and posing next to burning books inside of Gazan libraries has also surfaced, further lending credence to the idea that they aren't so much attacking Hamas in these instances, they're erasing the cultural edifices of a people they despise. The report is filled with much more incriminating evidence, but for the sake of brevity, let's move on to the dehumanizing, genocidal language used against Palestinians by Israeli authorities, soldiers, and settlers, which, when viewed in combination with their actions, can help us to infer intent. It's important to note that Israel's offensive on Gaza took place within the context of a long and, according to the ICJ, unlawful military occupation of Palestinian territory. This long history of malpractice and atrocities committed by Israel against the Palestinians comes with it a long history of dehumanization and bigotry. Israeli forces can be quoted referring to their offensive on Palestinians in Gaza as a fight between good and evil, often using language intended to strip humanity from Palestinians. For those who aren't sentimental when it comes to words, it's imperative to understand that degrading, racist, and dehumanizing language has historically been used to radicalize populations and convince them to go along with genocides, ethnic cleansings, and other horrors of the kind. It's not something to take lightly. In 2016, long before the October 7th attacks, Netanyahu can be quoted referring to Palestinians and Arabs in neighboring countries as predators or, according to some translations, wild beasts. He spoke about building a fence around Israel to protect his country from the predators. Minister of National Security Itamar Ben-Gvir, who was convicted of supporting a terrorist organization and inciting anti-Palestinian racism in 2008, said that his and his family's right to walk around the occupied West Bank is more important than the right of movement of Arabs. Then Minister of Defense and now wanted war criminal Yoav Gallant referred to Palestinians as human animals, and the H3H3 podcast referred to Yoav Gallant as a good guy. Major General Ghassan Alyan, head of Kogat, referred to Palestinians as human beasts. Netanyahu has referred to Palestinians in Gaza as people from an uncivilized world, wicked city, and jungle. He has framed the conflict as a struggle between the children of darkness, referring to Palestinians in Gaza, and the children of light, apparently referring to Israelis. In December 2023, the deputy mayor of Jerusalem said that Palestinian men were not humans and not even human animals. He went on to say that they are subhumans and should be treated as such. He continued by saying, "Erase the memory of Amalek, we will not forget." Amalek being a reference to the biblical story where Israelis massacred the Amalekites. Totally not a super genocidal thing to say. Netanyahu loves that one too. Israel also linked humanitarian aid with the release of the hostages, further implying that innocent Palestinian civilians suffering were somehow responsible for the hostage situation and didn't deserve aid until the hostages were released. Furthermore, the conflation of Palestinians and Hamas is used as a tool by Israeli authorities and settlers frequently. The idea that there are no innocents in Gaza is a sentiment repeated often, despite the fact that collective punishment is illegal. Israeli President Isaac Herzog said, "First of all, we have to understand that there's a state. There's a state, in a way, that has built a machine of evil right at our doorstep. It's an entire nation out there that is responsible. It's not true, this rhetoric about civilians not aware, not involved. It's not true. They could have risen up. They could have fought against that evil regime which took over Gaza in a coup d'etat, murdering their family members who were in Fatah." This sentiment was echoed by others in the region, specifically settlers in the occupied West Bank, where graffiti reading, "There are no uninvolved," can be seen painted onto watchtowers. This language is directly reminiscent of Herzog's statement. Ben-Gvir also conflated innocence with Hamas when he said, "To be clear, when they say that Hamas needs to be eliminated, it also means those who sing, those who support, and those who distribute sweets. All of these are terrorists, and they should be eliminated." I don't know if it gets any clearer than that. Oh, it does. Finance Minister Smotrich referred to Gazans as, quote, 2 million Nazis who want to slaughter Jews. Last time I checked, there are about 2 million Palestinians in Gaza, and not even close to all of them are in Hamas. Hardly any of them are, actually, so this is a clear conflation on his part. An Israeli soldier posted on social media a video of himself pointing at some goats and saying, "These are the only uninvolved in Gaza." In one video posted to X, Israeli singer Lior Narkis is seen performing a racist song to a cheering crowd of soldiers saying, "Gaza, you black woman, you piece of trash, you whore." I don't know why black women always gotta catch a stray like that, but You get the point. This guy's an asshole. It's clear that the degrading and dehumanizing ideas promoted by Israeli authorities have disseminated throughout the entire Israeli apparatus, from the politicians to the soldiers to the settlers. It's clear as day that they routinely conflate innocent Palestinians with terrorists and act accordingly. The celebration of the destruction in Gaza is common for IDF soldiers who laugh at and mock the decimation of Palestinian property through controlled demolitions, arson, and vandalism. Amnesty International collected 41 videos, audio recordings, and images showing Israeli soldiers doing just that. In some videos, IDF soldiers can be seen smoking cigarettes or pipes and casually watching and celebrating the demolition of buildings behind them. Are these really the actions of the most moral army in the world? The combination of Israel's conduct in Gaza and the dehumanizing, degrading, and racist language that accompanied it, when viewed in the context of apartheid, an unlawful blockade, and military occupation, serves as damning evidence. Amnesty International argues that it is sufficient evidence of Israel's intent to destroy Palestinians in Gaza. The constant disobedience in the face of ICJ orders and pleas from the international community, the attempts to impede humanitarian organizations in their effort to administer sufficient aid and necessities, the constant displacement while ignoring their obligations under international law to provide adequate living conditions and supplies, ignoring humanitarian organizations' requests for months, only to finally succumb to them after killing innocent world kitchen workers, but still failing to follow through. The decimation of cultural and religious sites in Gaza while celebrating and posing for pictures. The constant dehumanization through derogatory language and name-calling, even from those who hold the highest positions in the land. The withholding of fuel while claiming that they would send electricity to UN-managed water desalination plants, but then not actually doing it. Using 2,000-pound bombs in densely populated areas, airstriking residential buildings with no apparent military imperative, and killing generations of sleeping Palestinians in one blast. I struggle to see any other reasonable explanation for this behavior other than genocidal intent. To end this video with one more quote from the report, in assessing genocidal intent, Amnesty International analyzed such violations of international law. It reviewed them together and cumulatively, taking into account their recurrence and their simultaneous occurrence time and time again, compounding each other's harmful impact. Furthermore, the organization considered the scale and severity of the casualties and destruction repeated over time, in spite of continuous warnings by the UN and Israel's own allies, as well as the multiple binding orders of the ICJ. Viewed individually, the acts analyzed in this report constitute serious violations of international humanitarian law and/or gross violations of human rights. Viewed holistically, a more disturbing picture emerges. The commission of prohibited acts under the Genocide Convention, including killing and causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of a protected group, and deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. In conclusion, we need to stop being afraid to call this what it is. We have no problem calling out adversarial countries for the atrocities and war crimes they commit. We should continue to do so and condemn human rights abuses and authoritarianism in all their forms wherever they pop up. But that includes when they pop up in Western and Western allied countries.